It is indeed a great pleasure to be here on the UBC campus. I must say I've actually fallen in love with this campus, and I'm not surprised that when people come out west, they never return east. I can see why. So it is indeed a great pleasure. So as Aaron said, my talk today deals with the concept of serendipity, and my intention is really to get you thinking about what serendipity is and what it is not, and perhaps how it could be helpful in terms of us thinking about digital environments, information search, and how people engage with information, people, ideas, objects, and content. I'd like to start by also acknowledging some of my collaborators. The Socio-Digital Lab is a lab that I run with my students, so I thank them, of course, Jacqueline Burkell, Victoria Rubin, Kim Martin, and Nola Wong. So a lot of this work really is a collaboration amongst many of us. Now, in terms of the overview of the talk today, the talk is really not intended to be a single study, as many presentations are, but rather to provide you a larger overview of a field of research that I see emerging within our discipline. And so what I'll start with is a debate as to what serendipity is. I'll go over some of the models of serendipity. I'll discuss their strengths and weaknesses. Then the second section is on designing for serendipity, where I specifically look at online environments. In the third section, I'll discuss a study that we've done with scholars. In particular, our work has focused on humanists. And then I'll end with some conclusions and a list of current publications. So to start with, then, definitions and models of serendipity. Now, much of the information search literature defines information seeking as a goal-oriented kind of activity, and serendipity often is defined in opposition to some of those models. So a number of models of information seeking stress the relevance of browsing and exploration in the initial stages of information seeking. These models, however, do not have serendipity or exploration as an integral part or a central component of the model itself. But what happens, though, is that people will often, instead of looking for information purposefully, actually encounter or stumble open information in a number of different contexts. So it is really this phenomenon of stumbling open information that we're interested in. So, and I imagine that many of you have probably experienced this, that as you are in these online environments, you're not always as in control or as in full agency as some of these information-seeking models would like us to believe. So I think that many of us have had that experience rather of, navigating these information spaces as we go, changing our goals, encountering information, changing goals as we go. So I think it's this kind of experience that we're trying to describe here. And I would like to argue that this is more so the case in our social media environment. So, for example, Twitter and Facebook, where we really have very little control as to what information is coming at us, because a lot of that is done by other users. So it's sort of a community that really decides what information is included or excluded. Now, in terms of definitions, there's really no single definition or model of what serendipity is. Rather, it is a concept that is elusive and really difficult to define. Despite the difficulty in defining the concept, its relevance cannot be overlooked. A recent study comparing goal-oriented search and information seeking demonstrated really the relevance of information encountering. This research was done by Pals Dottir, and he specifically looked at Icelanders. You can probably find some similarities with Canadians there, at least in terms of the climate. But what he looked at was specifically health information. And during his research, he found that people in general were much more likely to accidentally encounter health information than purposefully seek out that kind of information. So that really sort of shows to some extent that even with something as important as health information, we're sometimes more likely to encounter that through other sources than to really go looking for it. The second thing that's really interesting about his work is that in the study, those people who were seeking the most for information were also the ones who were encountering the most information. So there seems to be some kind of a correlation between people that are very open to finding information, stumbling open information. And some of the research in the area of serendipity has shown that there's a correlation between some personality measures and this more sort of incidental information gathering. Further evidence comes from a study that we did, which I'll discuss more in a minute, where it was found that serendipity was central to the work of humanists. And then also Foster and Ford, in a 2003 article, have stressed the relevance of serendipity for all disciplinary areas, given its role in connection building, discovery, and creativity. So there's really quite a bit of evidence here coming together as to what serendipity exactly is. Now, I have some examples here for you. And one of the key arguments that I would really like to do today is to say that there really shouldn't be a single definition of serendipity. I mean, at least that's my personal point of view. In my view, it's much more useful in terms of understanding digital environments to think of serendipity as being composed of a number of different facets and phases, rather than it being a single construct. Now, if you look at these three examples, what would be your opinion of the first one? Is that an instance of serendipity, or is that perhaps something else? And don't worry, I won't evaluate you or give you grades on this. Yes, you think it is? How about the second one? Luann, did you want to say something?
Well, I wanted to say that it didn't necessarily learn anything new or unexpected in the first case. That would argue against it being serendipitous.
No, that's a very good point. You're very model-oriented. So how about the second one?
Even with the new media coming into the planet, that the force of serendipity continues through new media.
So it can happen in new media and old media.
Yeah, it's like magnetic. So it's able to go through like technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. How about the third example? Yeah, a lot of people. Well, to be honest with you, you can imagine the fun we had while we were doing this kind of coding, trying to agree when and when not any of these instances was serendipity. And really, my personal advice to you, if you're doing any work in this area, do it with your worst enemy, because no friendship will ever survive coding for serendipity. All I wanted to do really here was to show you the wide range of examples that you could find that could or not fall under this, potentially under this meaning of serendipity. And I think, Luann, you pointed out something really interesting, which has been much debate, actually, amongst my colleagues, which is this idea of the fortuitous outcome. Is there something to be learned? Is there a positive outcome, which is sort of a part, I think, of this notion of serendipity in itself? And it actually gets quite complicated, because you don't know when you found something whether it may have an immediate positive outcome but a negative long-term outcome. And as you can see, it can get quite complex in terms of exactly setting the boundaries as to when an example is or not a serendipitous. But what I'll do now is, in order for us to perhaps see a little bit more light at the end of the tunnel, is to go through some of the models of serendipity and just see, well, what have people said in the literature about how serendipity works. These are the three models that I've chosen. There's actually a fourth empirical model out there, which I've excluded because it's been put together by the same group, Macri and Blandford. So it's very similar to that model. And I know that Laurie McPeach, she's currently has a paper in JSIS on a review, which has a fifth model. So there could be potentially more models being added, but these are the ones that were available when I wrote this paper. And the model comparison paper is currently under review for the Encyclopedia of Science and Information Science and Technology. So if anybody wants a copy, I'm more than happy to share that with you. So the first model then, Sandra Erdeles, information encountering. This is a very interesting and quite unique model in terms of how the findings were done. She created an extremely unique and creative design of a controlled research environment where the information seeking was taking place in order to develop this model. So when you look at the model, she's now introduced a number of different terminology. One of her key terms here is information encountering. So she doesn't always talk about serendipity necessarily, but she calls it opportunistic information encountering or information encountering as a means to getting around of this somewhat vague and elusive concept. Perhaps the most important component of her model is that she talks about a foreground and a background problem. So what happens is that somebody is working on a foreground problem, and while you're engaged, in solving the problem, in finding information for that problem, you have a number of background problems or things that are in your mind, that are relevant. And as you are going through your, foreground problem, you may notice something. So you can see here at the bottom the first facet. So you can notice something that is happening in the environment that may be relevant for a background problem that leads you to stop the foreground problem, to examine that information in more depth, to capture that information, and then to return to the foreground problem. So really her model is a model of switching and of attention. You have a full focused attention on one issue. Something distracts you. And again, notice how I'm using the word distraction here. But something catches, your imagination, or something, seems relevant to something else that you focus your attention on, that leads you into a new direction. You pursue that, look at it, and then you go back at the first model. Now, what's really important to know here is that in order for this model to have been developed, she gave her students an assignment in class. She then invited them to participate in a study that was unrelated and was related to web analytics. And during the time, they accidentally saw something related to their assignment, and then they could either follow or not the lead. And I'd like you to really notice here, though, that what she found was that in this one very specific context, and again, environment and context here are very important, most of the students didn't follow the lead. So she actually found that most students neglected, the trigger and continued with their foreground problem. And the reason was because they felt that they were in an experiment, they shouldn't really be following it, even though 9 out of the 10 students did notice the lead and did make that connection, but didn't follow it. So obviously, context really plays a very important role. So now here, just briefly, some of the pros and cons of the model. I think that the fact that she has this foreground background is really important. She looks at switching and attention. She also examines in detail this issue of an active engagement with the material, making sense of it, relating it to previous experiences. And one that I really personally love is this notion of capturing. And in my future research, that's something that I'd really like to pursue more, which is this idea that we do often encounter information around us. Our environments are very information rich, but we don't always are able to capture the information and use it in the future. So I think that there's, in particular in digital environments, there's a lot of information coming at us that we may think is relevant or that we could use for other things, but we just really don't have that ability to capture that and to make it useful. And I don't know, how many of you use some kind of a RefWorks or EndNote system, Mendeley? You can out yourselves. Okay, because that would be an example of something that would facilitate or allow that kind of capturing in terms of taking data and maybe making it available in the future for another use. So on the right side are some of the problems. Clearly, the controlled environment is a huge issue. And that is something that is very difficult to get around. So how do you study serendipity if you cannot set up some kind of an experiment to look at it in more detail? Now, our study tried to get around that. So what we did is we looked at everyday chance encounters of information. And of course, the best available data we thought for this would be on Google Blocks. So we did a number of searches through a wide variety of queries where we tried to find naturally occurring descriptions of serendipity that were not really influenced by the research at all. So these were just available on blocks, and we analyzed those stories. I'll tell you a little bit about the problems and limitations in a minute. So this is the model that we came up with. And as you can see, there's some parallels clearly here with Erdeles's model. So first of all, for us, what was really important was the find. So this thing that is important, that is relevant, And we linked the find directly to what we call the prepared mind. And that's something that was already available in the literature. It's not something that we came up with. But having a prior concern or previous experience with something is really clearly important in terms of identifying and noticing the trigger and being able to bring the trigger in and use it. So again, act of noticing was really important in terms of the relevance in the environment of the trigger. And I think that this is perhaps where we see the most opportunity for design in digital environments and in library resources, is how can we help people notice better information? How can we help them, elaborate on more information as they encounter these very information-rich and complex environments? Finally, one of the things that was also really important in our model was this issue of surprise. So people often needed to have sort of an emotional connotation that went with finding that information, which is, wow, I really didn't expect to find this, or this is really important, or this is pretty neat. So that emotionality seems to be very important in serendipity. Now, here's some of the findings. And as you can see, there seems to be something going on with the difference between the online world and the physical world. Again, the online world would be searches, would be browsing online. The physical world would be things that we would encounter as we walk through the environment. And it seems as if ideas and information were encountered a little bit more in the online world than in the physical world, what items and objects were encountered more in the physical world. Clearly, our data is not representative in any means or way, so I think this needs to be further elaborated in future research. Now, some of the pros and cons. One of the big problems really with our study was that because we couldn't elicit the stories, some of them were, fairly limited in terms of the richness of the data, and we just had to deal with that. It would be really nice if one had naturally occurring stories that were more rich and had more details in terms of what's happening. Some of the pros here is certainly that it's in the context of everyday life, so it was very naturalistic, there was no bias, and that we really emphasized the outcome, that fortuitous outcome as an important component of the study. So the final model that I'd like to discuss is by Macri and Blandford, and they approached it completely different. So in order to develop their model, they did in-depth interviews, and they used the critical incidence technique to elicit stories on serendipity. So their data was really very rich. It had a lot of detail in terms of how the serendipitous encounter happened. They interviewed a total of 28 individuals in their study. And let me just find here my notes. And these were all interdisciplinary researchers. So they were also very much interested in how is serendipity connected to research, and how can we find, how people are encountering information and how that is helping them with their work. Now, if you look at this model, the emphasis is quite different. So really, at the center of this model is this making the connection. So it is about identifying something in the environment, leading towards new connection, linking it to previous knowledge and existing understandings, and through those connections, exploiting them and leading towards future action. So it's a little bit different in terms of the emphasis itself. So some of the pros and cons, I think in particular with this model, the active engagement and the making sense of the material is a really important feature, the exploiting the connection. The fact that they say that serendipity can only be understood as a retelling of a story. So it's not something that really, we can decide as an outsider whether it is serendipity or not, but it's something that very much the individual decides. So now, finally, a comparison across all the models. I must admit that this comparison is based on identifying some of the core features available across all models, and clearly that's quite difficult to do. But from an overview, we can see here that some aspects of the model have been neglected more than others. So in particular, the role of the environment is something that is really not explored much in any of the models, which seems quite important in terms of, well, how is the environment, how can the environment be manipulated to leading towards more noticing or less noticing? What kinds of environments lead to different kinds of noticing? Again, making new connections and insights, that was only emphasized in the Macri and Blandford model. The prepared mind was only emphasized in the Rubenburg-Kell and Quan-Haase model. I mean, overall, I think this leaves a lot of open questions in terms of, is it really a single phenomenon? Is there a problem really with the data? Maybe because the data sets were so completely different. Remember, a controlled environment, naturally occurring, and induced interviews. So maybe there's really something going on here in terms of how the data can potentially lead to different kinds of models and focusing on different aspects. Or maybe we just need more work in terms of trying to understand the various features and how they work. Okay. So why does serendipity then matter? What is really the relevance of serendipity as a phenomenon? Overall, in the literature, some of the key things that have been identified are related to the discovery of new knowledge, creativity, thinking outside the box, the trait of creative search, original thinking. And again, one of the things that we're really interested in at the moment is to study more this issue of distraction and focus. So when is really serendipity just distraction? And I mean, I think that's something that we all experience in our daily lives when we are searching on the web, which is the fact that often, there's a Twitter, a tweet, or there's a Facebook update. And is all of that taking us away from our work, or is it enriching our work and providing us with, new and different kinds of thinking? What is the role of our networks here? I think there's still a lot of open questions. So the next thing I'd like to focus on here is on this issue of designing for serendipity. And here in particular, this has led to a lot of media attention recently. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the developments there that we've sort of noticed. But in general, again, most of the models in information science that focus on digital search are still fairly linear. I mean, if we look at Macchianini 1995, we can see how there's a very linear kind of process in a digital information search. And I would like to argue that that is not always the case. I mean, I think that the argument here is not that that's not happening as well, but rather that in a digital environment, a lot of it is more sort of encountering information without that sort of very purposeful kind of interaction. Now, one of the things that, of course, the online environment has brought about is to open up that question as to whether it is leading to more open or to more closed search. And I think we really don't have necessarily an answer there yet, but Ellie Perry-Serre's book on the filter bubble makes the argument that, of course, customization and any kind of personalization of the search environment is, rather than expanding it, is actually narrowing it down. How many of you have seen his TED Talk on the filter bubble? Okay, great. So for those who haven't encountered it, I would really highly recommend taking a look at it, because he makes a very convincing argument also in his book, The Filter Bubble, on why we need to be concerned about the customization and personalization in some of these digital environments. One of the examples he provides in a TED Talk is Facebook, and how he has found that through customization, Facebook actually has removed information that he previously had access to, and how this can in part change the view that he has of the world simply because Facebook is just showing him what Facebook thinks he wants to see. So again, there's really this concern currently being raised in the literature about, are these search engines narrowing our search, or are they actually helping us to open that search? And Google views the whole thing differently. The CEO, Schmidt, has said that actually through complete customization and by, for example, using a Gmail account, email content to really get to know a user and all the other parameters, they would really like the user to be, they would really like to provide to the user the information that not even the user knows that they want. So again, they're talking about a serendipity engine here that can almost read your mind. I think it's a little bit worrisome. Again, a lot of people have actually argued the opposite. They have said that, for example, Gupta said that the problem with search is that we're so perfectioning in it that it's leading to the point where there's very little outside of what we want to look for that we can find. So again, it really opens up a lot of questions. So I just wanted to show you here Google's new knowledge graph. And this is their so-called Serendipity Engine. And the goal really here is to make knowledge accessible to towards widening and towards they call it sort of the sideways access to knowledge. So they don't want us to go through knowledge any more directed or linear, but rather what they're hoping for is that we can go always sideways and really expand that horizon. If we look at the search here for Dante Alighieri, you can see on the left is the usual, Google result, and on the right is this new kind of a mix of visual and content-based information that is meant to expand the search on a number of dimensions that they have identified as important. Now, what's relevant here is that they're using two parameters. One is really the network connection. So what have other people looked at that have also done the same search? And what other connections can we potentially create between what you're looking for and what other people have done? Again, here we can see what other people have searched for at the bottom and other books that are related to the topic on the top. And I can talk about this more during a discussion if any of you has any questions about it. Now, here's some further attempts in the library system itself to lead towards this more expansive search. So here the DPLA introducing a number of different concept models where what they're trying to do is to some extent replicate the library stack. So if we have that serendipitous moment within the library, how can we move that into the digital environment? And what they've done is they've basically created this idea of, well, if we can take books and represent those books spatially in the same way that they're represented in a library, again, somebody can look up and down. And the other thing that they've done, though, that is very interesting in terms of in network terms is they've color-coded the books to show what have other people taken out. So now you have not only the information based on what your search is, but you also have information on, well, what have other people done in the past who are interested in a similar topic, and you can follow the lead from there. At the bottom is Tim Sherratt, National Archives of Australia. And again, this is an environment where it's a curation of data, information, objects. And if you take a look at it more carefully, again, we can see that the main idea is that through visualization, we can, again, yield some kind of a serendipity. So as people navigate this very colorful, curated space of objects, every object leads towards more information. And as we sort of go through the space, we can encounter randomly information and object. Now, this is a study done by Tamara Reyes. And what she's looked at is specifically what does the library provide in terms of serendipity, and how well are these different systems supporting serendipity. So she particularly focused on 4 widely available systems. You can see them here listed at the bottom: Online Computer Library Center, OCLC, Ex Libris, and EBSCO. And what she's done, again, is she looked at a wide variety of features and tried to compare, well, how well are doing all these systems in terms of promoting these various elements of serendipity. And as you can see, they're doing very well at the top in terms of browsability, in terms of interactivity with the browsing, maybe keeping some of the information about past browsing. But when it comes to visualization in particular, here the third from the bottom up, there's really not a lot of work being done there. And this is very interesting to me because if you look at the computer science literature, all the support on browsing is done in visualization. So there seems to be a real disconnect here between what is happening, at the end of the user in some of these library systems versus what is happening really in computer science in terms of supporting more this sort of wider browsing and knowledge search. Okay, so now the third part of my talk will focus in particular on scholars. And I call them the digital scholars simply because a lot of the research today is showing that scholars themselves are much more likely to go to Google or Google Books than anywhere else. And I think that that's a finding that we really need to take seriously. And in addition, when we studied our historians, they often weren't aware of the fact that the library actually sits between the user and a lot of the resources that the user finds. So again, there's, I think, some problems here really in terms of how the information is being accessed. So why do we think that humanists are particularly important in terms of studying them in the context of serendipity? Well, there are, I think, 2 things here. One is that while scientists tend to often really, rely heavily on digital resources, humanists in the past have relied very much on primary sources. And the primary source is really still their most important source of information. And with some of the recent trends, and in particular in Canada, with Library and Archives Canada moving away from access to a lot of these original or primary sources, and there's a real concern, amongst these scholars that potentially this digitization could not only provide positive outcomes, but could really, remove a lot of what is central to the research process of scholars. And here are just some of the examples of previous research that has shown that serendipity is so central to the work of historians and humanists in general. Now, when we look at humanists and at historians, they have a very close connection with the book itself. They have a positive relationship with the library, and they have positive attitudes towards technology itself, and they're willing to explore new technologies, so they're not dystopian in general. Some of the motivations for us to focus on humanists was because there wasn't a lot of work done on this particular group, and not a lot of work had been done on looking at a single technology. Okay, so here, in terms of the methodology, we use semi-structured interviews with each of the participants. We did a grounded theory approach, so we coded all of our interviews, and we came up with a series of themes that were relevant. And amongst those, really one of the primary concerns for these scholars is the idea of the loss of serendipity. This study is in press and should be out in JSIS now any day, I'm hoping. But one of the key arguments that we've made there is the fact that serendipity is really central to these historians, and that for them, they're quite confused about how technology will change that. So they're not quite sure how these digital environments will work. They see both opportunities as well as concerns. So it's not as if they're just negative about the technology, but they would like to understand better how, how digital sources and so on is perhaps affecting, first of all, what they can find, but also once they found that information, how it is affecting their ability to interact with that information. And I just want to stress here that for these scholars, this very tactile involvement with books and archives is really very central to them, which may be less central to social scientists or scientists. So I think that it's really important to look at different kind of user groups. Now, also the discovery of sources is very important to them. So they were happy with using Google Books. Actually, many of them said, well, I use often Google Books, but also really important here, Google Books and electronic books serve well as secondary sources for them, but not as their primary sources. So they still want to have that access to the book or to the archive in terms of their primary sources. Here, another example of a library catalog that could potentially help these historians, and which they were willing to explore, which is this idea of different kinds of recommender systems. So in their interviews, they said, well, look, if these digital systems can provide us with new avenues, with new forms of exploration, then we would be happy to, to go the digital way. Here, another project, The Real Face of White Australia. This project is, I think, to me, one of the most successful ones in terms of both integrating sources, the serendipity component, but also the tactile element of the physical into the digital. And when you go to the website, I fell in love with it. And in part it is also because my great-grandfather immigrated from China to Guatemala. And this project is all about, Chinese or non-white immigrants to Australia. And when you go on a website, the first thing that you see is like this, mosaic of faces that looks at you. And through the exploration of faces, you interact directly with the catalog. So the idea then here is that you can access the information through different venues, and that the information can be visualized and displayed in different ways, and that it can be useful not only to scholars, but also to people who, to the public in general who's interested in ancestry and other kinds of research questions. So I think this is a very powerful way of looking at this. So this is a model look-around that we're currently developing, and we see look-around as sitting between a user and a library, and it is still just a prototype. And what the way that we envision it as working is that you would basically go with your mobile app through the library, you would scan the books, and as you scan the books, they would open up information that is being pulled through from the web and other sources that expands basically that search. And what we're hoping here is that people basically can further explore that long tail instead of going into the library and perhaps just finding the book that you're interested in looking for. And we're thinking that this could be particularly useful for undergrad students who often have an apprehension towards browsing and exploration, because it simply would help them and facilitate them to find new dimensions through which they can explore the information space. Furthermore, we also see serendipity as happening in social media. In particular here, we're really keen on finding out how hashtags and handles and also the notion of the back channel could potentially further enhance encountering information. And I mean, what's really important to notice here is that when you're on Twitter, you're doing a lot of the filtering. So there's no system really doing the filtering. And only that, I mean, your Twitter followers are not completely random. So again, going back to the definitions of serendipity, I think that it's important to notice that serendipity and chance doesn't always have to be 100% chance. I mean, you're assembling your network of followers, and you are scanning through that information and noticing what information is important. So, I mean, I think what we're trying to say here is that thinking of it in terms of a combination of algorithm and human mind is probably the best way of approaching any kind of design towards enhancing serendipity. Okay, so in terms of the conclusions for today's talk, the first and perhaps most important thing is that these kinds of models and ways of thinking are moving away from a linear approach and emphasizing more this idea of discovery and browsing of information, people, and resources. And again, we're not just limiting it to really information, but we believe that people are conduits to information, and therefore understanding that is also important. Secondly, that sometimes through these systems, perhaps we can better allow people find what they don't know that they want. So it's really this idea of finding dimensions that doesn't provide completely irrelevant information. That's why chance may not be the best kind of factor here, but rather to help people sort of expand their information universe. Further, it's about eliciting exploration, curiosity, and excitement. And I think that this idea of excitement is particularly important because, as we saw in some of the models, this issue of surprise and the emotionality, which I think is often neglected in information search, is really, really important here, because that, I think, will further elicit more curiosity and more exploration. Further, we truly believe that it's about looking at alternative ways of presenting, contextualizing, and visualizing information. And again, here there could be a number of different ways. Now, in terms of some of the important publications, I mean, I'm more than happy to converse with anyone or send you sources if you're interested in a topic. But my book, Technology and Society, just came out. Actually, it's 2013, so that's wrong there, sorry. And then this is our forthcoming paper in JASIS that looks at tradition, serendipity, and opportunity in the adoption and use of e-books in historical research and teaching. So to end my talk, do I have one more minute, or how am I doing? Yes? Okay. So the last thing I wanted to just do sort of as a fun exercise is, well, to think about how does this serendipity or browsing knowledge sideways, which is the way that Google puts it in terms of their knowledge graph, how does that look like? What could be examples? How could we support users in digital environments through that? And I just make these up, so they're not really real. But I just sort of thought, to start the discussion, we could look at them and think, are they real? Actually, Alyssa, that should be me. I'd like to get a tenure track position here. It's such a great place. So, but I think the idea here is, could any of these things be considered serendipity? Like, how can we enhance these kinds of things in these digital environments and better understand how these sidewise move towards information goes? And here another example. So again, this was a search on Pablo Picasso, and it's really interesting because if you do the search, of course, you get the common Google results here on the left. But if you look at the right, you'll see that there's a famous picture where Pablo Picasso paints Modigliani. And again, all of a sudden, there's a new connection there between Picasso and Modigliani that you may not have known about. That could then lead, someone to further explore, well, why is there a picture of Modigliani in one of Picasso's pictures? Why would he have painted the other painter? And that then can lead to an exploration of, well, what was the connection between the two, and how did their art influence each other? So I think that Google's new approach to the knowledge graph can potentially lead toward more this sideways walk of knowledge. I mean, I think they're just at the beginning of it, and it probably needs to be a lot more complex. But I think it just can get us thinking about, well, what are the kinds of ways that we could potentially maybe approach this kind of task. Okay, well, thank you.
You aware of Gary Ganosko's book, Remodeling Communication?
No, I haven't. That's
You may want to know I thought he was at the Western Ontario at some point the last few years. But anyways, Gary Ganosko, Genosko, Remodeling Communication, starting with the Shannon Weaver model and working through the models that came and reacted to that. I want to know if he would be interested in the serendipity factor in remodeling communication. And the second thing, are you aware of Marshall McLuhan's tetrad? You ever heard of Marshall McLuhan's 4 laws called the tetrad?
I think I have. I don't remember them now at the top of my head.
Yeah, because the tetrad experience might fit into what people are experiencing. Basically, the tetrad was new technology enhances a new aspect, a new environment, that obsolesces a recent environment, retrieves something that was forgotten and obsolesced a long time ago, and then pushed to extreme, it flips into opposite characteristics. That might be, you might want to do a tetrad on serendipity, because it seems that serendipity, the more you look for it, you're countering. You have to not look for it for the surprise factor.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
It's very difficult because if you're trying to make it happen, it's no longer serendipity.
No.
So you're
There's another factor to that because long ago, if you photograph someone early in the morning and then later on by the evening you walk straight on their path, so it was controlled serendipity. But then if someone doesn't want to receive the invitation, you're never going to meet them.
so you're implying ESP going on.
Well, it's pre-mobile phone. It's like communication from the funny side. So,
Well, and I think that's why my argument is always, it makes maybe more sense to think of the models, because there, once you look at all the different facets, you may not need to have everything always happening together. I mean, I think that, these digital environments, and as you were saying, the designing for experiences, or as McLuhan would say it, the tools are us and we are the tools. So, we're constantly engaging with those tools. So, potentially, that could lead towards helping us, have one aspect of cognition be more focused than another. So, I think that's a really good point.
Did you say something about you don't want to use the term chance? Did I hear you say you want to go beyond the chance idea? Did I hear you say that?
Well, I think that the problem with totally leaving it up to chance is that, of course, chance gives you randomness. So there's a really good example in the literature where Gupta, who was interested in these information systems, he is really frustrated because he finds that the information systems are really narrowing us down. So he loves encyclopedias, for example, and he loves dictionaries because he says that as you browse through different words, this can lead towards finding new words or, just you looking up anything. Whereas if you go through an information system, you have much less opportunity to go sideways. So his idea was, though, if you put in randomness into an information retrieval system, that randomness then can lead you to, for example, if you're looking for information on Vancouver, then you get information on salamanders. And he's like, well, this would be perfect because now you're discovering something new. But of course, the more you introduce randomness into a system, the less you will get relevant information. So it can't be totally up to chance either.
Right.
But for example, there are systems like Stumble Open and so on that have been developed that introduce some element of chance, but are still giving you information back that could potentially be highly relevant because it's based on previous searches. So it's hard to know how much of it should be controlled and how much should be random.
McLuhan based all his work in a way, translating Finney's weight. Finney's weight is like the new I Ching, people sort of go through and just see what they find. Have you looked at Finney's weight as an archetype of chance and yet trying to linearize or bookize chance, or put it in a book form? Have you looked at the weight?
Yes. Well, you'd be really interested if you go to Wired magazine. They just have an article that came out, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was last week. And I read it and I was completely fascinated because they describe how they've acquired this company that is basically creating some kind of an ontology behind all of the keywords and knowledge that is out there. And they're trying to impose basically this ontology on the body of knowledge in order for them to be able to create these kinds of answers. Because what they're arguing is that with Google search, as you said in the past, it was all based on those keywords. But the algorithm, of course, doesn't understand what the keywords mean. So if you look at something like cat, it may just give you it may give you a randomness of different kinds of answers, but you may actually be looking for cats as in the Broadway performance, the show. So what they're trying to do is now completely disambiguate that by providing an ontology. And again, the question then is, will that allow us to better navigate, or will it more, as you suggest, close down?
For the last 2 years, the algorithm was changing and we were making more and more changes. So basically, the internet that you're getting isn't actually the whole content of the internet. It's a very limited version. It's closing down world possibilities really because, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I suppose the power card would be in the hands of the coders with the algorithm and then the SEOs. So, they want everybody to have an artificial serendipitous moment. All you have to do is be number one on Google. Whereas before it was more, kind of like...
Well, and what's interesting in one of our studies is also that people experience their digital environment as uncontrolled. So we had a number of examples where people were looking for X, and when they found instances of X, they described that as serendipitous because in these digital environments, they have so little control over how they navigate the information search that even instances of what they were looking for was perceived as being a fortuitous outcome, which to me is very surprising because, Yes, Caroline.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I didn't see in the model, and maybe it's there, is the psychology of the individual. So things like, you can design the most incredible system, and then people come in with a set thinking and a focus. I think it was one of your earlier ones that I didn't see the psychology element. And I'm reminded of things like the studies of witnesses, where they show a little video and nobody notices the gorilla with balloons because they're concentrating on looking for particular cues. So where in paired mind, that's different. I'm also thinking that something like users have to come halfway. A lot of the time we're talking about serendipity, you have to be halfway into the right environment in order to actually encounter something that will be close to us. So it's not totally random. We are bringing ourselves halfway. So where's the individual in here?
No, those are very, very important comments. And I think there are two things here. One is that the individual has been represented in some of this work in terms of personality. So there's a lot of work coming out of Europe by Heinstrom in particular, Jannica Heinstrom, where she tries to find if there are personality traits that are in particular associated with an opportunity for encountering information accidentally. And if I should have checked this morning, but I think it was openness, which is one of the, and that wouldn't be surprising because it's one of the most stable personality traits, is associated with this kind of browsing or so that would be one thing. But I think what you're getting at more, if I'm understanding correctly, is also this context. And I think in particular, Sandra Erdeles' study talks to that because she's basically showing that this context could potentially be really important in terms of how we deal with the information we're encountering, so that not all contexts will elicit the same kinds of actions. And I mean, some of my work on it's on how basically how we self-control ourselves in these digital environments, even though it's absolutely not related to this, I think can provide some insight, because what I found there was that sometimes students, and this was again done with undergrad students, but what I found there was that they would often be very willing to browse, Facebook, or to spend a lot of time on instant messaging just prior to an assignment or something, because I think it sort of relieves stress and, it has to do with procrastination. But then, I know, don't we love browsing the web for hours and checking our tweets? But what was interesting in this case was that there were always moments where they themselves forced themselves to do something about it. So some people were more proactive and others were less, but there was always a moment where they would be like, okay, this is enough. I have to delete my Facebook. I have to now focus. And I have a sense that that's getting at this context issue a little bit, because there are always moments in a day, and I think there was another study done by Bonnie Nardi and someone else who they looked at managers and when they wanted to be interrupted, and they found that there were times where managers would love to be interrupted. Between 10 and 11, there are managers, everybody can come in, but then there are times where they really need to focus and get their work done. And I have a sense that serendipity may be something like that. I mean, there's a time where we need to finish a presentation and we're very focused, and it doesn't matter what comes at us. We're not going to be that easily distracted unless it's really important. Whereas there may be other moments where we're much more willing to engage in this kind of browsing and exploration. And there is some work done in information science on these more purposeful models, which suggests that early stages of a project are where this browsing and exploration is happening. I personally don't quite believe it in that way. I mean, what I do think is that this can happen on a daily basis or on an hourly basis, where there are moments of exploration and moments of focus. I don't think it is the kind of thing that if you're working on a 2-year project, you'll be doing the first 2 months exploration and browsing, and at the end it will be all focused. So that's where I think we need to maybe change it. I don't know if this answers or addresses some issues.
Process models there, although I think we can have a discussion over lunch, but because I think actually you do that in projects. That doesn't mean you as an individual are doing things differently every day. I think we do search at the beginning of the project. I think we do. Otherwise, we'd never get to the end.
No, that's true. But I wonder whether you could still discover something unexpectedly at the end of a project and still bring it in. So I think I'm just saying that it doesn't have to be so closed up as maybe some of the models may suggest.
On this when you were talking about this particular slide, you indicated that these 3 studies all use different methods to sort of bring these models together. So I can relate that you're studying a construct that's very challenging to define, get everyone on the same page with, and try and articulate what it is. And so as you move into trying to design environments for serendipitous encounters, do you see measurement challenges? Because, typical things like how many times a page is accessed are not really going to be good indicators here, because it's those people going off the beaten path. So any thoughts around where measurement is going as you move into design?
That's excellent. And Laurie McKay, she's currently doing her PhD on the topic, and she just interviewed me for one of the studies of her PhD, and her work is really quite phenomenal. What she was doing is she was looking specifically a little bit at exactly that. I mean, she's working with Elaine Thomas, and they're really looking at, well, how can we design the environment in such a way that we can elicit those things? So is it the kind of thing where if we have, let's say, different kinds of noticing happening in either colors or in flashing things, is that something that people will follow more? And then I think is where the measurement comes in. Will people then start clicking that, and how far will they go? How many steps away will they go from that original search? Where it will be interesting to take a look, because then in part, I mean, I think it becomes this thing of focus versus distraction, because the further it moves you away from where you are, the harder it will be to get back. But at the same time, that's when, I mean, as I said, a lot of this is linked to the research on innovation and creativity. And of course, there we would say that it is exactly at the junction of disciplines and of information that most innovations will happen. So maybe it is good to move away several steps, as you were just suggesting, from that original piece, because that's exactly where we would find things that we didn't expect and that we would usually not encounter. But I think, I agree that there will be probably a challenge in terms of measuring when is it distraction, when is it really a serendipitous encounter, and can we evaluate that?
We're a few minutes after, so perhaps we could continue this conversation in person with Anabel. I didn't mean to cut you off, Heather, sorry. But in the meantime, maybe we could give Anabel a round of applause, and thank you for coming and speaking.